Russia is the largest country in the whole world. In terms of sheer size, no other country even comes close to the massive 17 million square kilometers it covers. It is so big, it is the only country in the world actually part of two continents, stretching all the way from Eastern Europe to the coast of East Asia. Russia is so massive that the entire area it covers is equal to the size of the United States, 9 million square kilometers, and Australia, 7.6 million square kilometers combined. Isn't that wild to think about? However, there is a line that divides Russia into two parts. This line greatly influences the way in which Russia's population is divided. But what is this line, and why does it exist? Is it a real physical division or just an imaginary line? Well, we have the answers to all of that. But to begin, the line is the Ural mountain range that separates western Russia from its eastern part. Even the part of Russia that lies to the east of the Ural mountain range is 12 million square kilometers in size, which is larger than India, 3 million square kilometers, and China, 9 million square kilometers, put together in terms of area. But both India and China blow Russia away in terms of population, as despite the fact that it is so huge, all of Russia only has a population of just over 140 million people, which is only about 10% of the population of India or China. But now we come to the strange part. Even though the majority of its land lies to the east of the Ural Mountains, this area of 12 million square kilometers only has a population of 38 million people. This is only about a quarter of its entire population, but they live in an area that covers over 3/4 of the entire country. So why is the part of Russia to the east of the Ural Mountains so sparsely populated? Well, that's what this video is all about. But before we get into the reasons for this, if you're new here, why don't you take a moment to subscribe to the channel, especially if you enjoy content like this. We are always coming up with new videos like this one on interesting topics from around the world. So if you subscribe, you'll never miss another great video. Alright, now that that is out of the way, let's get into why Russia's population is so disproportionately spread out. Reason number 1, the history. To begin, we must look at the history of Russia and how it has developed over the years. Russia, as we know it today, can be first traced back to the establishment of the Rus state in the 9th century. This is also where the name Russia was eventually taken from. The first identifiable form of Russia was this empire formed by the East Slavs, the largest subgroup of the Slavic peoples, who were spread around Eastern Europe and what is Russia today at that time. In 882, Prince Oleg of Novgorod seized Kiev and united the northern and southern lands of the Eastern Slavs under one united empire of the Rus state. This empire stretched across Eastern Europe and the western portion of modern Russia, to the west of the Ural Mountains. This state remained in power in the area until the early 13th century, when repeated invasions from the powerful Mongols caused several losses in the population and led to the disintegration of the Rus state. After the 13th century, this area divided into a number of small kingdoms and duchies that were scattered throughout the area, who paid tributes to their Mongol overlords. There was no power strong enough to unify them, until the rise of Ivan the Great, who united them in the Grand Duchy of Moscow and finally stopped the paying of tribute to the Mongols, whose strength had also begun to decline by this time. It was his grandson, Ivan the Terrible, who transformed them into the Tsardom of Russia in 1547. With Russia fast growing in strength in the next few centuries, they soon began to look east for new territories and resources to support their growing empire and people. The Russian Empire began their conquest of Siberia, as the region east of the Urals was known, in the late 16th century. At the time, this region was populated sparsely by indigenous peoples, as well as the remnant of Mongol tribes that had settled there after their own invasions of the area. The Mongols who remained in the area all came under the rule of Sabir Kahante, which was ruled by Kuchum Khan. Over the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, the Russian Empire slowly took over Siberia, slowly pushing eastward from their base of power in Moscow. They reached the Pacific by the end of the 17th century. The Cossacks, as the Russian troops were known, massacred huge numbers of the indigenous peoples, as well as Mongols, as they expanded their empire to the east. The Cossacks, in the same mold as their Mongol oppressors in the past, demanded that these conquered peoples pay them tribute in the form of furs and the other scarce resources in the area. They also slowly began to change the natives' way of life by having their own people settle in these areas, and over time integrated them as part of their empire. Even today, the Slavic Russians outnumber all the indigenous peoples in this eastern part of modern-day Russia, a legacy of their brutal invasions of the past. However, they were never able to populate this area densely, as the climate provided too challenging and the land was not suitable to support large numbers of people. This is how Russia of today came to control all the land east of the Urals all the way to the Pacific. Reason number 2, the climate. The next reason for the low population of the lands east of the Urals is probably the most important: the climate. For centuries, this area has been one of the harshest regions known to man due to the intense cold of its sub-zero temperatures. These temperatures make these parts extremely unsuitable for human habitation, and they are almost wholly covered in permafrost. But what is permafrost, you may be asking yourself? Well, to put it simply, any ground which remains below a temperature of 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 years can be termed as permafrost. And according to Climate Change Post, 65% of the Russian Federation, which is equivalent to the entire area of the Urals, is covered in permafrost. This means that this entire area is always freezing cold. Now, we can hear you thinking that, all right, it's understandable that in the past, with the lack of technology, these conditions would have made it challenging for people to live in these areas. But surely now, with the progress we've made and indeed the technological prowess of Russia today, it should be possible for more people to live in these lands. Well, that's not the case, and here's why. What are the 2 things that all humans need to survive? Food and water. And while water is readily available in these areas due to the huge quantities of snow and ice that can be used, food is in short supply. Agriculture, which is a marker of humanity, is simply not possible due to the permafrost and sub-zero temperatures. No crops can grow in these terrible conditions. Therefore, most humans who live here have to survive on a diet of meat, and the indigenous plants that grow in the vast coniferous forests are not exactly the forests you're thinking of. They consist of dry trees without much greenery, adapted to these freezing temperatures that stretch for miles and miles. They are not exactly suitable for providing much else than firewood. However, in the past, tribes and indigenous people who lived here survived on meat from the ample herds of reindeer that roamed these lands, and who they domesticated to help feed themselves. However, remember how we mentioned that the Russian invaders asked for tributes when they took over these lands? Well, these tributes were largely in the form of these reindeer herds and the furs of other animals, which were widespread in the area, due to awful mismanagement of these herds by the Russian troops, as they took them in their greed while spreading east. Today, the numbers of these animals are not even comparable to what they were in the past, which is a shame, because if they were present in large numbers, it would be a lot easier to feed the people who chose to live there. Well, why can't food be transported east from west of the Urals with the modern modes of transportation that we have today? Well, it can be, and that is largely how food is provided in these regions today. But this is not as easy as it seems. The major cities are all towards the south of the area, where it's slightly warmer, and these are connected by roads and railway lines. though the infrastructure is poor. Due to its massive size, terrible climate, and the deadly permafrost, it's not easy to build railway lines and roads in this eastern part of Russia as it is in the west. The M58 highway, which connects part of it to the west, was only completed in 2010. The Trans-Siberian Railway and Baikal-Amur Main Line are the main railway lines that connect eastern Russia to the west and have been operational since 1984, but they're not enough to connect the huge area in any meaningful way. Additionally, they are mainly used to transport the resources of eastern Russia, such as oil and minerals, to the west. In Siberia, aviation is the main mode of connectivity to the west, but here too the infrastructure is poor, and most places do not have the capacity to land large planes, which means the ability to transport large amounts of resources is difficult. There are ports to the east and the north on the Arctic and Pacific coasts, but due to the freezing temperature, the seas are often filled with huge blocks of ice. It's difficult to sail large ships through these areas. From all this, it's quite clear that the climate is the main reason for the low population of eastern Russia. It simply makes it impossible for resources to be transported there easily. And to be honest, who would want to live in such frigid conditions? Reason 3. Culture. Firstly, looking at Russia's culture, it is clear that it remains quite similar to the cultures of other countries in Eastern Europe, like Ukraine, Serbia, Romania, and Georgia. In fact, prior to its dissolution, these countries were a part of the USSR, which eventually became the Russia of today. In fact, due to the end of the USSR being a fairly recent event in terms of modern history, many Russians still have their roots and family members residing in these countries of Eastern Europe. But looking further back in time, these countries also have the same cultural roots as the Russians, as most Eastern European peoples are also descendants of the Slavic people, just like the majority of the people living in Western Russia are today. This Slavic heritage is also a big reason why Western Russia is much more populated than the East, because the people want to live close to the area their culture originates from, as well as being close to others like them in Eastern Europe. Additionally, religion also plays a big role here. Russia is home to about 40% of the Orthodox Christians in the world, some 100 million out of a total of 260 million. But if you took the percentage of Orthodox Christians residing in Europe, including Russia, it's closer to 77%, and most of these people are concentrated in Eastern Europe. This means that Russia and the Eastern European countries account for nearly 200 million Orthodox Christians today, almost 80% of the remaining population, while the other two major forms of Christianity, Catholicism and Protestantism, have become much more dispersed across the world. This concentration of Orthodox Christians in Eastern Europe is important. Why? Well, because it too plays a role in the western portion of Russia being more populated than the East. Due to the widespread nature of the religion across Eastern Europe, Western Russia also draws in many Orthodox Christians who want to be closer to their community, thus making the land east of the Ural Mountains less populated. Reason number 4, economics and population issues. Finally, we come to the last two reasons for the disproportionate population density of Russia. After the end of World War II, the USSR was in a dire state. They had lost over 8 million soldiers in the war, more than double of any other nation, and total deaths, including civilians, were estimated to be over 25 million. With a lot of these, especially the soldiers, being young men, the country was at risk of facing serious population issues in the future. And indeed, this is what happened. By the end of the 20th century, Russia's population was facing a massive crisis. Their fertility rate was the lowest in the world, and the death rate was higher than the birth rate. This meant that Russia had a fast-aging population, and with the young immigrating to other countries, this was only set to get worse. The young people who could not leave instead flocked to the more populated portions of Russia, searching for jobs and opportunities. opportunities. Areas were obviously to the west of the Ural line. Moscow and St. Petersburg, Russia's two most populated cities in this area, and the population density in these: 5 people per square kilometer in Moscow, and almost 4 in St. Petersburg. On the other hand, in most of the areas east of the Ural line, the population density often does not cross 1 to 2 people per square kilometer. In fact, the region Chukotka in the northern east set the record for the lowest population density in the world, with only 0.07 people per square kilometer. But why do people flock to Western Russia over the east? Well, firstly, for the reasons already mentioned, to be closer to their history and culture, and because the east has terrible climate conditions. But perhaps, more importantly, they go to Western Russia because that is where the money is. Moscow and St. Petersburg may be the most densely populated regions in Russia, but they are also the most wealthy. The western population of Russia is where the best jobs and opportunities are offered. To the east of the Ural Mountains, people must suffer and lead a challenging life to earn a decent living. They believe that in the West, their chances are better, even if there is more competition. The West has bigger cities, better infrastructure, more people, more ports, better weather, and better all-around connectivity both within Russia and the countries surrounding it. No wonder the region east of the Ural Mountains is sparsely populated. But what of the future? While Eastern Russia has always been in the shadow of the West till this point in time, the future may be very different. While climate change is something that threatens all the world, for the part of Russia east of the Ural line, it may be a blessing in disguise. Want to know why? Well, because climate change brings with it global warming, and global warming melts permafrost. It's already begun, and the areas covered by frozen ground are already decreasing. If the permafrost were to continue to decrease, regions in eastern Russia would soon be able to implement agriculture, add more roads and roadways for connectivity, and with the melting of the ice in the Arctic oceans, new ports could also be established. This would basically help the eastern part of Russia begin to catch up to the part west of the Ural line. Climate change may look bleak for the rest of us, but for Eastern Russia, it brings with it a glimmer of hope. If Eastern Russia were indeed to develop in this way over the next few decades, there is no reason that it could not catch up with its Western counterpart. And it may one day be part on par with the western part of Russia if it continues to grow and develop. We'll just have to wait and see. So, what did you think about this line dividing Western Russia from the eastern part? Did you know about this already? Did we miss out on any facts or information you think should have been included? Well, let us know in the comments section below.